In 1666, a single spark from a baker's oven lit a fire that wiped one of the world's greatest cities almost completely off the map. For 4 days, London was reduced to ash. But how? How did a city that had stood for over 1,000 years get taken down by a small fire in a single bakery? Well, this isn't just a story about destruction. It's a story of human error, of sheer panic, some bizarre coincidences, and in the end, resilience. So forget the dusty old history books. We're going to take you to ground level. You'll feel the heat, smell the smoke, and experience the terror of the Great Fire of London as if you were right there. We will walk the very streets that burned, see the desperate choices people were forced to make, and uncover how this catastrophe would forever change the face of London. Before we can get how London burned, you have to understand what London was. The city in 1666 wasn't made of stone and steel, and it was a medieval labyrinth, a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. This was a place that had just been through the absolute horror of the Great Plague the year before. A city of roughly 500,000 people where life was just starting to feel normal again, but the scars were still fresh. Now picture the streets. These aren't grand boulevards. They are narrow, winding alleys, slick with filth. The buildings were mostly timber framed, jammed together so tightly you could barely squeeze a hand between them. And they had these upper floors, called jetties, that stuck out over the street. On some lanes, neighbors could practically lean out their windows and shake hands. This meant sunlight barely ever hit the ground, and a fresh breeze was a rare luxury. This design, while it gave people more living space, created a deadly kind of funnel. Air couldn't really circulate, but fire could. And it could leap from one overhanging roof to the next with terrifying ease. And in the late summer of 1666, after a long, hot, dry spell, all these wooden buildings were bone dry. They weren't houses anymore. They were stacks of perfectly seasoned kindling. And inside these buildings, especially in the warehouses down by the River Thames, were the fuels of a global trade hub. Barrels of oil, tar, brandy, and coal. All the ingredients for a firestorm. And the city's infrastructure was just as vulnerable. There was no organized fire brigade. Each parish had some basic tools, leather buckets, axes, and these long hooks to pull down burning houses and create a firebreak. They also had fire squirts, which were basically giant metal syringes that shot a jet of water. They were clumsy, didn't have much range, and were totally useless against a major fire. London in 1666 was a marvel of its age, the heart of an empire. But it was also a city living on a knife's edge. All it needed was one fateful spark. That spark came just after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd, at the home and business of Thomas Farriner, the King's Baker on Pudding Lane. This wasn't a fancy bakery. They made hard, dry biscuits called hardtack for the Royal Navy. We'll never know for sure, but the story goes that when Farriner's family went to bed, embers from the oven weren't properly put out and lit a nearby pile of firewood. And the first person to notice something was wrong wasn't the baker, but his journeyman. Around 1 or 2 a.m., he woke up not to flames, but to the choke of the smoke. He raised the alarm, waking up the whole household. By then, the fire had consumed the ground floor and was racing up the stairs. There was no escape that way. Panicked, Farriner, his daughter, and the journeyman scrambled out of an upstairs window and onto the roof of the house next door. But one person didn't make it, and the family's maid was too scared to jump the gap between the buildings. She stayed behind and became the first known victim of the Great Fire of London. In these first few minutes, the fire was still just a neighborhood problem. Neighbors were woken up and a frantic, disorganized bucket brigade started. It was pointless. The fire was feeding on the bakery's wood and the flammable stuff in the buildings next door, and it was getting stronger. A strong easterly wind had also picked up, a devastating turn of events. Instead of burning itself out, the wind began pushing the flames west, down Pudding Lane and toward the wharves on the Thames. The local constables saw this was way beyond their control and went to find the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Roused from his sleep, Bloodworth came to see what was going on. His reaction would go down in history. He dismissed the growing fire with contempt, famously saying, "Pish, a woman might piss it out." He refused to let anyone pull down houses to create a firebreak, worried about the cost and the arguments. Then he went back to bed. It was probably the single worst decision in London's history. By 7 a.m., his words had become a bitter joke. Around 300 houses were already gone. The fire, shoved by the wind, had raced down to the riverfront, where it found a feast. The warehouses there were packed with combustibles like oil, tallow, and coal, and the fire just exploded in intensity. Around this time, the famous diarist Samuel Pepys was woken by his maid. He looked out his window and, just like the Lord Mayor, thought the fire was far away and went back to sleep. When he woke up a few hours later, he learned the shocking truth. The fire was now threatening London Bridge, which was a strange structure itself, covered in houses and shops. Flames began to eat the buildings on the north end, but luckily, their advance was stopped by a gap, a firebreak left over from an earlier smaller fire. It was a small mercy on a day of growing horror. Blocked from moving south, the inferno was now funneled west and north, straight into the wealthy heart of the city. As Sunday wore on, panic set in. The narrow streets became clogged, not just with smoke, but with people desperately trying to save their stuff. Carts were loaded high with furniture and goods, creating gridlock. The Pepys described seeing people throwing their things into the river or onto boats, staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them. He even saw pigeons, unwilling to leave their nests, hovering around windows until their wings caught fire and they fell. By Sunday evening, the fire had become a self-sustaining firestorm, creating its own wind that sucked in oxygen and drove the flames even harder. Pepys, watching from a boat, after wrote with despair, "We stayed till we saw the fire as one entire arch of fire from this to the other side of the bridge. It made me weep to see it." London was entering its first night of hell. Night offered no relief, only a terrifying, fiery dawn. On Monday, that strong easterly wind was still relentless. The fire, having devoured the riverside, now turned its full fury north and west, pushing deep into the city's financial heart. King Charles II and his brother, James, the Duke of York, saw the devastation firsthand from the royal barge. Unlike the Lord Mayor, the king got it. He ordered Pepys to find Bloodworth and give him a direct royal command. To spare no houses, but to pull down before the fire every way. Pepys found the Lord Mayor in a total state of collapse, like a man spent. When he got the king's order, Bloodworth just cried in despair that nobody would obey him. He had completely lost control. The window to contain the fire had slammed shut. On the ground, it was total chaos. The authorities banned all carts to try and clear the streets, but this just made the panic worse. People now had to carry their belongings on their backs, a human tide flowing through streets showered with embers. Pepys himself started moving his most valuable possessions, his money, his silver, and his precious diary, to a friend's house far from the flames. By mid-morning, the fire hit the center of English commerce, Lombard Street and Gracechurch Street. Yet home to the rich bankers and goldsmiths went up in flames. Then, the Royal Exchange, the magnificent heart of London's trade, was engulfed. But the fire wasn't just destroying buildings, it was tearing society apart. Ugly rumors started to spread. England was at war with the French and the Dutch, so suspicion immediately fell on foreigners. Mobs started hunting for supposed enemy agents, and paranoia gripped the city. People started arming themselves. I convinced the fire was a coordinated attack before an invasion. By Monday evening, the King and the Duke of York took command, setting up command posts and overriding the useless city officials. James, the Duke of York, personally led firefighting parties, forcing civilians to help. The King himself was seen on the streets, covered in soot, passing buckets of water and encouraging the exhausted crews, his presence a small bit of order in the pandemonium. But despite their efforts, the inferno raged on. By the end of Monday, the fire had eaten about half of the city of London. The heat was so intense that it created fire drops, embers carried by the wind that would ignite houses streets away. As darkness fell for a second time, there was no real darkness. The sky just glowed a pulsating evil red. The city was being eaten alive. Tuesday was the day of peak destruction. The fire advanced on the city's cultural and spiritual heart, St. Paul's Cathedral. This wasn't the domed church we know today, but a massive medieval Gothic cathedral, one of the grandest in Europe. People thought its stone walls were the ultimate fireproof safe. They had packed its vast interior with their most precious goods, books, furniture, anything they wanted to save. They thought it was the one place the fire couldn't touch. They were wrong. The cathedral was being renovated and was partly covered in wooden scaffolding. As the flames got closer, the embers caught in the timber and the scaffolding ignited. By evening, the city watched in horror as its greatest landmark began to burn. The sight was apocalyptic. The writer John Evelyn described how the stones of Paul's flew like grenados and the melting lead running down the streets in a stream. The massive lead roof melted and cascaded into the streets like a molten river, and the heat inside became so intense that the huge stone pillars exploded and the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, incinerating everything stored inside for safety. The fall of St. Paul's was a massive psychological blow. If it could fall, nothing was safe. At the same time, the fire was pushing in two other dangerous directions. To the east, it crept towards the Tower of London. The tower wasn't just a prison, it was the city's main arsenal, holding tons of gunpowder. If the fire reached it, the explosion would have leveled what was left of the city. The soldiers at the tower, getting no help, took matters into their own hands. They started using gunpowder to blow up whole rows of houses, creating a massive crude firebreak to starve the flames. To the west, the fire leaped across the River Fleet and began to threaten Whitehall, where the king's own court was. The royal household actually started packing, getting ready to flee. The entire city, from its ancient fortress to its seat of power, was on the brink of being wiped out. As Tuesday night fell, London was a nightmare. More than 80% of the walled city was a ruin. The glow from the fire was supposedly visible 40 miles away. It seemed like it would only stop when there was nothing left to burn. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, something changed. Right before midnight, the ferocious easterly wind that had been the fire's best friend for 3 days finally started to die down. Wednesday, September 5th, dawned with a little bit of hope. The wind had dropped, and for the first time in 4 days, the firefighters' efforts started to actually work. The fire breaks created with gunpowder were finally holding. The inferno, starved of fuel and without the wind to push it, began to falter. The fire wasn't out, not by a long shot. Smaller fires still raged, and in the cellars, full of coal and oil, would continue to smolder for months. But the single, city-destroying monster was broken. Samuel Pepys climbed a surviving church steeple and looked out over what was left. He called it the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. Where a bustling city had stood 4 days earlier, there was now just a smoking, ruined landscape. By Thursday, the fire was officially declared under control. The king announced that the fire was an act of God, an accident, trying to stop the violence against foreigners and restore some order. Now, the true cost could be counted. The statistics are staggering. The fire had gutted 436 acres, destroying over 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and dozens of livery company halls. Somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people were now homeless, living in makeshift camps in the fields outside the city. And yet, the official death toll was, and still is, unbelievably low, only a handful of recorded deaths. This number is almost certainly wrong. In a firestorm with heat intense enough to melt lead, bodies could have been completely cremated, leaving no trace. And the deaths of the poor or minorities often didn't get recorded back then. The real number is likely much higher. In the aftermath, the city desperately needed someone to blame. They found their scapegoat in a French watchmaker named Robert Hubert. Hubert confessed to starting the fire as part of a Catholic plot. His story was a mess and made no sense. He even claimed to have started it in a part of London the fire never reached. Despite clear evidence that he wasn't even in the country when the fire started, the terrified authorities rushed him to trial. Hubert was hanged, a tragic sacrifice for a city looking for vengeance. Recreating this event and understanding the decisions that led to the disaster is a powerful reminder of how fragile our own world can be. And if you find these deep dives into history fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our next video. And let us know in the comments, what other historical event should we recreate from the ground up? The Great Fire was a catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. But from its ashes, a new London would rise. The total destruction was also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to rebuild a medieval city for a new modern age. King Charles II was key to this. Just days after the fire was out, he declared that the new city would be built of brick and stone, not wood. The narrow alleys would be replaced with wider streets to act as natural fire breaks. Of course, it was easier said than done. Grand plans to remake London on a neat grid, like Paris, were mostly rejected. The city was a tangled mess of property rights, and people needed to rebuild their lives and businesses quickly. So, they started rebuilding on their old foundations. But critical changes were made. A new building act banned wooden buildings and required wider streets. London was reborn, not in a radical new shape, but as a stronger, more fire-resistant version of itself. And Sir Christopher Wren, whose grand city plan was set aside, was given the huge task of rebuilding the city's churches. He would ultimately design 52 of them, plus his masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. In a strange twist of fate, the fire had done what Wren wanted to do all along: demolish the old decaying cathedral to make way for his new vision. The great dome of his St. Paul's would define the London skyline for centuries, a symbol of the city's rebirth. To remember the disaster, a massive column, simply called the Monument, was built near Pudding Lane where the fire began. Designed by Wren, it stands to this day as a permanent reminder of those terrible days in September 1666. In the Great Fire of London is a story of destruction, born from a spark of carelessness and fanned by a perfect storm of bad luck. But it's also a powerful story of a city's ability to endure, to learn, and to rebuild itself from its own ashes.